Hi everyone, my name is Brittany J Jones, and Madalynne has asked me to step in to record the sew-alongs for her new Madalynne X Simplicity pattern 8995. In this video, we will be sewing view A on this pattern. Madalynne has also teamed up with Mood Fabrics to bring you a collection of fabrics that are perfect for her new pattern. There's a crepe back satin, a cotton poplin, as well as a metallic knit in that collection. And those fabrics are also 10% off. So click the link down in the description box and you'll be able to view these fabrics. So now let's go ahead and go over the pattern pieces that we need to cut out to sew up view A on this pattern. The first pattern piece that we will need is pattern piece number 3. This is our neck binding and we need to cut 1. Pattern piece number 4. This is the sleeve ruffle and we need to cut 2. Pattern piece number 5. This is our sleeve and we need to cut 2. Pattern piece number 2. This is our back piece and we need to cut 1 on the fold. And we also need to cut out pattern piece number 1. This is our front piece and we need to cut 1 on the fold. We also need to cut out pattern piece number 9 as well as pattern piece number 7. Now we are not cutting these out of fabric, but these are the elastic guides that we will need to measure out the elastic for the lower elastic guide of our top as well as for the sleeve elastic. So again, we're not cutting these out of fabric, but we will use these to measure for our elastic. For fabric, I am using this black knit. This is a rayon blend. It is really nice and lightweight and soft to the touch, and I think it's going to pair well with view A on this pattern. Before we begin sewing, I want to go over a few things. When you're sewing with knit fabric, you want to make sure that you are using the proper needle. So I'm going to be using a jersey ballpoint needle in my sewing machine while I am sewing. You could also use a stretch needle if you like, depending on your type of fabric. But for me, I will be sewing with a jersey needle. Depending on the weight and texture of the knit that you are using, you may want to use a walking foot. This foot has feed dowels on the bottom of it, so it will help your fabric to guide through with the feed dowels on the machine so that one layer isn't pulling through faster than the other. So depending on the weight of your fabric, you may want to use a walking foot. My fabric is lightweight, it's not bulky at all, so I won't be using my walking foot, but again, depending on your fabric, you may want to use one. And I'm also going to be using this stay tape along the shoulder edges of the top. You could also use hem tape or clear elastic if you have that. You could also use some interfacing if you have that. But I have this stay tape right here, and this we will sew right along the seam line of our shoulder seam. It will help prevent our shoulders from stretching out over time as we wear our garment. So now let's begin sewing. The first thing that we're going to do is to do a row of stay stitching along the neck edge of our front and back piece, and we are going to stay stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. For this stay stitch, we're going to stay stitch in the direction of the arrows that were on the diagram. So they went from the top of the shoulder to the center, and then from the top of the shoulder to the center. So I'm going to go ahead and line it up with 1/4 inch. Alright, so I have the stay stitch done along the neck edge of my front and back piece. The next step is to go ahead and put our front and back right sides facing. And now we're going to pin up here at the shoulders. Make sure that you match up your notches and pin in place. Now, if you want to use some stay tape, this is where we would use it at, or you could use the clear elastic, and you just want to put it right up here. I'm going to put mine though on the back of my top, so once I have it sewn, I can press my seam toward the back and you won't be able to see the stay tape there. So I'm going to align this up with the stitching line, which is 5/8 inch, and I'm just going to pin that in place. All right, so I have my stay tape pinned on to the back seam allowance. So now I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to do a zigzag stitch at the 5/8 of an inch seam line. I'm going to be using a narrow zigzag stitch. I'm going to pin my other stay tape along the back seam allowance the same way and go ahead and stitch them both down now. So this is what my shoulder seam looks like, and the stay tape gives it some stability. So now I'm going to go ahead and finish off my edges with my serger. All right, so I have my seams sewn and I've also finished them off with my serger. So now I can go ahead and press my seams toward the back, and when I do that, you won't be able to see my stay tape, which is why I put it on the back seam allowance instead of the front. So now I'm going to go ahead and press my seams. I'm going to go ahead and press my other seam the same way. All right, now that I have both of my seams pressed toward the back, I'm going to put the top to the side and go ahead and grab the neck binding. With the neck binding, we are going to put right sides facing. We're going to pin right back here at the center seam. Now we can take it to the machine and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, now that I have the center seam of the neck binding sewn, I'm going to just press that out just a little. And now on the long unmarked edge of our binding, you should have transferred markings on one end. On the side that does not have markings, we're going to press up 3/8 of an inch. Be careful with your binding not to stretch it out. And also when you are ironing, you just want to press. You don't want to wiggle the iron around. It will stretch out the fabric. Continue pressing up 3/8 of an inch on the unmarked edge of your neck binding. Now that we have pressed up 3/8 of an inch on the unmarked side of the neck binding, now we can go ahead and pin it to the neck edge. So go ahead and grab your top. To attach the neckband, I am going to attach mine on the wrong side of the fabric first. I like to do that because once I have it sewn on the wrong side, then when I roll it to the right side of the fabric, I will be able to follow along and clearly see my stitch and the edge of the fabric. So that is how I am going to attach my neckband. So I have the wrong side of my fabric facing up. I am going to match up my markings that I transferred. Those circles, they match up with the shoulder seams. I'm going to pin in place. I'm going to stretch my band to fit, but not my top. Just want to stretch the band. All right, I have my neck binding all pinned. Now I'm gonna go ahead and stitch this in a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm gonna just do this on my serger. However, if you want to use your sewing machine, you can go ahead and do your zigzag stitch to stitch this on. So I'm gonna go ahead and do it now at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so I have my neck binding sewn on and I pressed my seam going up toward the neck binding. So now we are going to take that pressed edge of the binding and put it right over the stitching line and pin in place. So just continue to fold over your neck binding and pin it right past that stitching line. All right, I have my neck binding all pinned. I have that folded edge of it pinned right past that stitching line. So now I'm going to go to the machine and I am going to do a narrow zigzag stitch right along this folded edge of the neck binding. If you have a twin needle, this would be the perfect time to use it. Or if you have a cover stitch, you can also use that. So let's go ahead and stitch down our neck binding now. All right, so I have my neck binding sewn on, and here is a closer look at my binding. So now we can go ahead and start working on the ruffle. All right, for our ruffle, we are going to put gathering stitches along the marked edge of our ruffle piece. So one of the edges don't have any markings or notches. We are going to put the gathering stitches on the side that does. So let's go to our machine now and go ahead and do our 2 rows of gathering stitches on both of our ruffle pieces. All right, I have the gathering stitches on my ruffle pieces. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab my top and open it out. You should have a notch right here that will match up to the notch on the ruffle, and the circle that you transfer that's in the middle, it matches up to the shoulder seam. So I'm going to begin pulling up the gathers on my ruffle and adjusting it to fit the top. Once you have gathered up your stitches for your ruffle and you have your circles and notches matching, you can go ahead and pin in place. All right, now that I have this side pinned on, I'm going to do the same thing to the other side, and then I'm going to take it to the machine and baste this in place. All right, I have my ruffles basted on. So now we can go ahead and grab our sleeve. And you want to match up your notches. So I have a notch here. So this sleeve will go there. And you want to match up your circles as well and pin in place. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and pin my other sleeve the same way. Then I'm gonna take it to the machine and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so now that we have our sleeves sewn on, I also finished off my seam allowance with my serger. We can go ahead and put right sides facing and pin down our side seam and underarm seam. Once you have it pinned, you want to go ahead and pin your other underarm and side seam the same way, and then take it to the machine and stitch it at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, after we have our sleeves sewn on, we can go ahead and remove our basting stitches from our ruffle. And the next step, we're going to go ahead and start working on the elastic for our sleeve and the lower edge of our top. So I'm going to put this to the side. And I'm going to grab piece 6. This is the elastic guide. We need to cut 2. And I've already gone ahead and cut 2 the length of the elastic, and I didn't stretch it out. I just laid it on top and cut it. So now we can take it to the machine and we can lap it over like so. You don't want to put it like this. Make sure that you lap it. and we're going to stitch the elastic to secure it, and then we'll trim off the excess. So let's go ahead and stitch both of our elastic pieces now. Alright, I have both of my elastic pieces sewn, and I've also trimmed off the edge of it. So now, working on the inside, the wrong side of our sleeve, I'm going to put the elastic around it, right along the lower edge of it. I'm going to match up the stitch of my elastic with the seam of my sleeve, and I'm going to pin there. And we are just going to pin right along the edge of our sleeve. You will need to stretch your elastic as you go around. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and go to my machine. I'm going to stretch this area out once I get over there, and we're just going to stitch really close to the edge of our sleeve using a wide zigzag stitch. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, now that we have the elastic sewn to the lower edge of our sleeve, now we're just going to fold that up, and we're going to stitch right along the previous stitching. So let's go ahead and do that stitch now. Alright, so I have my sleeves all sewn. The next step is to start working on the hem of our shirt, and we're going to do the same exact thing that we did for the sleeves. So we need to take our elastic guide, which is piece 7, and measure out one piece of elastic. I have mine here. I've already measured it out. So now I'm going to take it to the machine, and I'm going to overlap them and stitch to secure them right now. Alright, so here's my elastic. I have it all stitched. So now I'm just going to pin it to the lower edge of my shirt. Alright, so I'm going to go to the machine, and I am going to do a wide zigzag stitch along the lower edge, the same exact way that we did for the sleeve, making sure that you stretch the elastic as you're sewing and not your top. So let's go ahead and stitch the elastic on now. Now that you have your elastic sewn on, we're going to flip it up, same exact way as we did for the sleeve, and stitch right along the previous stitching. Once you have your hem done on your top, the last thing for us to do is to go back and tack up right here along our shoulder seams. We want to tack it up to the seam allowance right here to make sure that this seam stays up. We don't want it to drop because it will make the ruffle kind of lift up. So you want to make sure that you tack your sleeve seam right here along the shoulder seam allowance only. We don't want it to go through the shirt. So just tack that, maybe 1 or 2 tacks just to hold that in place, and then you'll be all done with your top.